going to be doing a bunch of different podcasts, looking at a lot of different avenues that I've been kind of collecting, things that I've been thinking about. And instead of just me talking about what I think, I figured, hey, why don't I have people joining me on the show? So today we're going to be talking about civic religion, and joining me is Nik Kreiger. So Nik, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So Nik, before we dive into this topic of civic religion, why don't you let the audience know who you are, a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so my name is Nik Kreiger. I have a Church of God background like Scott. I am a Marengoite, you might say. I went to Camp Marengo for many years, and Scott was a staff member when I was a camper, and then I ended up being on staff. So I met my spouse there, just like everyone else. So yeah, I have a pretty considerably deep Church of God history just within myself, I guess. I have actually a Catholic background, so I have a couple of different worlds I draw from when I think about civic religion, but religion in general. So I am a former youth pastor. I was the youth pastor at Park Place Church of God in Anderson, Indiana. I was youth pastor when I was going to seminary there at Anderson University. I got their missionary degree, Master of Arts in Intercultural Service. Nowadays, I am a data scientist at the Cleveland Clinic. I went back to school again, got a biostatistics degree, so I help with medical research statistical stuff, but still always interested in my faith. It's still very important to me, and I love to talk about it.
All right. Thank you, Nik. So for someone who may be listening to this podcast and they say, well, what's civic religion? Like, how would you define that?
I guess for me, civic religion would be the intersection of religious ideas with being a citizen of an actual state or a city or a country, I guess. That's kind of one definition. Another definition may be the religion having to do with such a state or a country, that kind of thing. So I know there's a few different places that are arguably have a civic religion, and America is definitely one of them, where you have sacred symbols having to do with the country. There's an origin story that's important. There's even sacred texts, that kind of thing. So those two, I think, are what probably most people think of when they say that phrase. I'm not sure what you think.
Yeah. And I mean, I would agree with that. I think, when I think of civic religion, I think I like the way that you say intersection.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times when I think about my faith and even think about some of my views with local, state, or even federal politics, there's a part of me that I think there's always sometimes that wrestling in some ways, where how much am I converging more of my faith and trying to think about my ideals and my beliefs that are faith-based, and then how do those intersect, or how do those maybe not intersect at all with my political beliefs? And right. I think so I would agree with those definitions. It's interesting when you talk about America and different symbols, because it seems like a lot of times, or especially growing up in the church, I've always heard people talk a little bit about America being founded on Christian values, Christian principles, and then you go to Anderson, which again. Go to Anderson, and sometimes it's like, oh, that's not entirely true. More of a deist type of deist kind of religious views than what we would kind of term as Christian views. So when I think about that, how does civic religion, I guess, in a way, plays in kind of everyday's lives, or how does it play in your life when you're trying to navigate that intersection between faith and rules of states?
I think awareness of the existence of civic religion is like the thing to think about, the very first thing to think about when it comes to that topic, because certainly there'd be a lot of people, maybe even some listeners, who have never even considered how politics or their status as a citizen of America or anywhere else, how that has to do with, their religion. And so I think you have lots of people. I can really only speak for the American church.
Mm-hmm.
I think you have a lot of people in the American church who have never even considered that the two might not always jive together.
Mm-hmm.
They might be at odds sometimes. And then for those of us who are aware that, there might be two different ideologies coming at you when you're thinking about your religion and your status as a citizen. Some people think they actually go together quite well, and some people might not. Where I'm sure you've heard arguments that patriotism is dangerous for the church, or you've heard people say patriotism goes hand in hand with being a Christian if you're an American. So I think there's a lot of disagreement on that topic.
Yeah, and I think what the picture you kind of painted there, I think, is very good, especially with awareness, because there's a lot of times where I think, and again, like, I can only speak for the American side of things because I really don't know too much about how religion and state issues or politics kind of intersect over in Kenya. I do know with my sister-in-law who lives in Northern Ireland, there is still kind of some of that tension between Northern Ireland and Ireland, or the Protestants
Right.
and Catholics over there. And I'm sure that kind of goes into play when it comes to any type of decisions that need to be made that would affect the rest of the country, even though Northern Ireland's technically part of the UK. So they're kind of like their own little party on that little section.
A country within the country.
Yeah, but I think when it comes to like church, and especially in that regard, you mentioned how, like, some people, like you mentioned the idea of patriotism.
Yeah.
I think sometimes, especially growing up in the church, it seemed like, especially on holidays, it was like, well, we celebrate religious holidays. So like Christmas, you decorate the church for the season. Easter, you decorate it for Easter. Pentecost, not too much decorations for Pentecost.
Bummer.
But then when it comes to things like, 4th of July or Memorial Day or Veterans Day, then those are like some big patriotic holidays where the church really, not only as far as decorations kind of decorate things, but even when it comes to song choices. I think there was one time I was at a church, and when I was traveling, or when I was looking for a church, I think I traveled to a church, and it would be very easy for people to sing "God Bless America."
Right.
I mean, obviously it's in the hymnal, so you can pull up. Or
I was going to mention that if you didn't.
Yeah, "O Canada" is also in the hymnal too. Some of the older versions. So you see that there is kind of that intersect between faith and national, and I wouldn't say nationalism, but maybe that's too harsh of a word. But it's kind of like that thing where it's like, okay, here's patriotism, here's religion. Some people like, no, let's keep that separate. Some people go, well, it comes into play. And I can remember growing up in the church, there used to be, when there would be like Senate elections, or like kind of big major U.S. elections, even like now, like with the presidential elections, there would be easy that I could open up a church bulletin, and there would be an insert, and it would be like all the different candidates, what they believed. And then it was like, I think it might have been Turning Point USA. I think that's who. And then they'd have a check mark by everybody who they would recommend you vote for.
Right, yeah.
And usually, I think 100%, it was always Republican candidates.
Yeah,
I don't think I've
from
ever
Turning
seen
Point, I think that's pretty expected. But I'm sure there's a lot of churches had that experience where either from the pulpit or in distributed material, they're very much encouraged. This is the candidate for Christians to vote for, that kind of thing. And the fact that there's so much disagreement really shows, illustrates once again the breadth of experiences people have when it comes to civic religion, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that I used to say that one of the big threats facing the American church in general is not really a great understanding of Scripture and what Scripture is, and that's a whole other podcast topic. But lately I've been thinking, I think it's actually bigger than that. It's not necessarily just biblical interpretation. I think it's not totally understanding church history, not really being aware of the ins and outs, and tracking from the church from Pentecost, if you want, all the way up to the church that any given Christian is a part of. Mm-hmm. Because you can see all throughout church history, even very early on, even in the Bible, even in the book of Acts, you have the intersection of civic religion and the state. One of the examples that's been swirling around in my head, as I've been preparing to talk, is the part where Paul asserts the fact that he is a Roman citizen. Mm-hmm. In the book of Acts. And I'm not sure I've ever heard a sermon on that specifically, but I feel like that's just a perfect opportunity for any given Christian to, look at, okay, there's Paul. His loyalty is to the church, first and foremost. It's to Christ, he would say. Mm-hmm. But then he thinks it's a good idea to invoke the fact that he's a Roman citizen. Does that mean he has a loyalty to Rome? Like, well, if we know the whole story of Paul, he ends up, mm-hmm. Being imprisoned, and so how high of a view could he possibly have of Rome? But I just think that's a really great example that's been mostly untapped in my experience as a way to understand how religion intersects with your citizenship.
Yeah. And I think that's great because, again, like I'm with you. I don't think I've ever heard anybody preach a sermon on that. Yeah. Or if they do, they kind of skim over the whole Paul invoking his Roman citizenship and kind of using that as a power play in some ways.
Yes.
To be able to, to be able to use it for his advantage.
Right.
But I also think that I think kind of where, we talk a little bit about civic religion and how sometimes those things can actually work well together. I remember I had a debate with a former staff member, Ryan Garnes, which we mm-hmm. both know Ryan. We both worked with him. And I can remember, this might have been years. It might have been like episode 50 on my podcast. But I remember talking about politics and saying, and I made the statement that, the church shouldn't be involved in politics. Mm-hmm. And he absolutely kind of confronted me about it and goes, well, why not? Like, I think as Christians, we should be part of the political process. And my whole point was, sometimes it can get toxic when you have mm-hmm. that interweaving of religion and politics, faith and citizenship. I think there's a reason why when we look at our First Amendment, there has to be that freedom of religion. I think from a state view, you don't want one certain denomination or one certain religious institution to kind of have rule over the whole entire mm-hmm. country. I mean, that was the main issue that they had with England. That's the main issue we see overseas with Europe, where, whoever was the ruler, their religion was invoked on. So whether they're Protestant or Catholic, and if you were Protestant and the king was Protestant, yay. If the king was Catholic and you're Protestant,
bummer for you.
Yeah, there's going to be some hardships for you.
Right, certainly.
So especially when it comes to church life, one of the things that I have seen, I think growing up in the church, that I've seen little bits of, like almost like breadcrumbs. And now I think even in today's culture where we see almost like a smorgasbord, is that if you have a certain political stance on a certain topic and you are a Christian, sometimes you can be criticized, ostracized, or even sometimes you can even be blatantly, people could basically say, well, you're not a Christian.
Right.
And recently, like 2 episodes ago on my podcast, episode 99, I read this article in I can't remember the article, Gen Medium. And it was talking about how evangelical women were not only leaving the conservative Republican Party, or they said they're mm-hmm. abandoning Trump, but they're also leaving their churches as well.
Yeah.
And I think this is kind of like almost like, where I see that that's kind of a big issue. And I think that's kind of a bigger issue now than I think it was when I was growing up as a kid.
Right. Yeah. I think when it comes to issues of church unity versus the church getting political, I think generally when it comes to Christian unity, I think we have two sides of a coin there. And, there's a few Jesus quotes that come to mind when I think about politics and religion. And, he says, unless you, what does he say? Unless you hate father and brother and mother, you have no part with me, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, I haven't come not to bring peace, but a sword. I think these are the pieces where we shouldn't really, if we're really following in the footsteps of Jesus and doing what I think the church is called to do, we probably are going to expect there to be some conflict, because I happen to agree with Ryan Garnes that I think what the church is supposed to be is inherently, not fully, but inherently political in part. And I don't know, maybe some listeners really don't want to hear that at all. But I guess I'm kind of revealing a little of where I stand with that. But the way I read the gospel now, I can't unsee the pieces where he is specifically, being critical of the Pharisees. That's the one we're most familiar with. But you also have him being critical of the temple leaders, and then also, the Roman government. Mm-hmm. How can it be the case that Jesus is actually very political then, and we're supposed to be totally non-political today?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, and I know the argument right after that is often, well, how can you possibly compare, the Roman Empire with the United States? And I guess I have some thoughts on that too. I think like this statement here, I think, should not be controversial. I think the church is supposed to be the number one ally to the poor. That's easy. And when it comes to how to live that out, obviously, then people start disagreeing with that kind of thing. But where I think people who really love the idea of separation of church and state, I think oftentimes when they're living that out in their ideal life, in their thought life, they don't actually really know how to separate their religion from their politics, because I think a lot of people are trying to find a way to be involved in the political process, and like they want to be able to explain their whole idea of how everything should work in their city and their state and their country, as if they're running for president. And they also want to say that, that just fits perfectly with the church's mission as well. And I think Jesus never calls us to do that. I don't think Jesus called his 12 disciples to come up with ideas for how exactly to reform the Roman Empire and how exactly to reform the temple cult of the time. I think he instructed them to just be champions for the poor and oppressed. And what the metaphor that I like lately that's been swirling around in my mind is, I think Christians should be lobbyists for the poor and oppressed. Lobbyists are those who go to government officials and say, these are my interests. I want to do whatever I can so that these interests are fulfilled. So there's the big oil lobby. They want to try to make it so they can sell oil as much as they can with as few regulations as possible, as few taxes as possible. They don't care how that ends up affecting the government as a whole. They just want to make sure that their interests are taken care of. And so I think Christians are supposed to be lobbyists for the poor, where we don't necessarily have to come up with, the national budget for how the poor are taken care of. We're just supposed to be the ones always knocking on the door saying, hey, what about the poor? Hey, what about the poor? How are the poor going to be taken care of? We don't have to be the ones that come up with, the budget, or we don't have to be the ones that come up with the policies. Maybe some of us will. Maybe some of us are actually good lawyers and can come up with policy. But I think the church as a whole needs to get back to its roots of being champions for the poor and oppressed, and just being a voice for them.
Yeah. And I would agree with you. I would say that, for me, when I think about my ministry and kind of the goals that I want to see within myself, within my family, and within my church, when it comes to faith, is like, are we being kingdom people?
Yes.
Are we living out the ethics and the rule and the teachings of the kingdom of God? Because again, that's what
Right.
Jesus came to proclaim was, that the kingdom is here.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
I think that's kind of where, when we talk about the separation of church and state, I think that's where that does get a little dicey, because even if, as much as I want to kind of say, oh no, everything's separate, I'm sure there's times where there are some things that intersect. And even when
Yeah.
you bring up a good point about talking about, most everyone would say, well, helping the poor, that should be the first thing that the church should kind of be champions or
Hmm.
lobbyists for. It's just
Yeah.
when you talk about policy and procedures and how you actually achieve that, those are two different things.
Right.
For someone like, I think about, one of my buddies who's in Florida who does a lot of gardening and does a lot of different splicing and trying to teach people how to do agriculture and train them
I
for
think I know the
missionaries so they
buddy.
go overseas. Yeah, we have a mutual friend, and that's his way of helping the poor. And then I can think
Yeah.
about my dad, who's a CFO of a steel equipment supplier,
Yeah.
and how, for him, it's like, even though he could be making, good money being a CFO of that and having projects, for him, it's like, well, with that money, I invest it in certain ministries. I invest it into things, it's not like I have all this money, so I'm going to hoard it and then just kind of build up my portfolio. It's more of,
Yeah.
hey, it's almost like I have these opportunities, I have these gifts and these skills that I can help people through financial means, or to help support certain ministries to be able to help those who are poor or impoverished. So,
Absolutely.
and that's the thing. And I think kind of the big thing too, when it comes to that idea of where we can get into disagreements, is like, sometimes I think it's interesting how some people would say, well, if they took a political test and they said, okay, how would Jesus respond to these
Yeah.
answers? I think most of them would be shocked on where they would fall up. I remember high school, I had to do two tests, one for me and figure out where I lined up, and
Yeah.
one on a historical figure.
Yeah.
And I remember I did mine on Jesus. And
Yeah.
I think at the time I was kind of moderate leaning towards the right.
Sure.
And when I did Jesus, he was more kind of moderate, more on the left side. And it
Sure.
was like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
And I know sometimes people go, oh, yeah, well, if Jesus was alive, he'd be a Democrat. It's like,
Yeah.
well, at least when I took this back in the 90s, that wasn't entirely true, but
Yeah.
he was leading a little bit more because, again, a lot of people on the left care about programs, helping people, doing this, doing that, big government, so that they can help people. And I get all
Sure.
that. The one thing that I think kind of boggles my mind sometimes, and maybe this is something, maybe I'm going to get a flaming arrow in my chest after this comment, but I can remember having a conversation with someone who, when they took one of those tests, they're all the way, almost kind of like all the way over to the left, as liberal as you
Hmm.
could be.
Yeah.
But because of like one issue,
Yeah.
they vote
On the other side.
on the other side,
Sure.
which I think for me, I think sometimes I have a hard time with that. It's like if I was dating, which a good thing I'm not doing that anymore. But if I had like an eHarmony profile and I match with someone, and out of the 10 things, I match 9 out of the 10, I don't say, oh, there's that one thing I don't match with, I'm not going to,
Yeah. Yeah.
we won't do that. But yet when it comes to our politics and our belief, especially when that intersection between our political beliefs and our faith beliefs, sometimes we do see that because of one issue,
Right.
we're all the way over on the other side.
Right. I have a hunch of what issue you might be talking about that made the person vote on the right. And I don't necessarily want to come down with judgment on that
Yeah.
specific topic. We're talking about abortion, obviously.
Yes.
And I think abortion, I think, is actually a pretty good illustration for the kind of, I guess, unawareness of how our idea of what the state is and what our religion is, how people aren't able to extract those two apart. Because I think I think generally, it's probably the case that most Christians would say, yeah, we want abortions to decrease, but one of the sticking points is, how are we going to achieve that? And for many, that's, making it illegal. And right there, that word illegal, that is a state related word. That is a civic related word when we're talking about, laws, because the church doesn't have power to make laws. So in doing somebody who is voting voting to be anti-abortion is usually voting so that the state is going to make laws against it. So you're using civic religion, like both, together at the same time, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And, the other side of the debate, which I think is, I feel like only more recently do I hear more about it, is a different way to change levels of abortions is, making contraception, more, easier to acquire and that kind of thing, or, investing in, communities. And that's, I think that's the result of kind of a rising left in our country. But that also has to do with, the government and the state taking action. It's about, the government taking taxes from people and using the taxes to, redistribute that money elsewhere. And so I think a lot of abortion activists in the church, one way or the other, don't really realize that they are only thinking in terms of how the government relates to abortion. They're not really thinking about how the church itself actually is relating to abortion. And I'm sure a lot of people have considered the idea of, like the church should be more willing to adopt or something like that, or the church should be willing to sponsor mothers who find themselves in a place where they feel like they have a hard decision to make. But most of the time, the abortion debate is talked about in terms of what is the government going to do about it? Are they going to make it illegal, or are they going to invest money so that they go down in a different way?
Yeah. And I know when my wife was going to school to do law and become an attorney,
Mm-hmm.
looking at Supreme Court law,
Yeah.
obviously we have Roe versus Wade, but then there was
Mm-hmm.
also another, and I can't think of the court case, but there was one where the Supreme Court they could have went all the way back to basically completely, undo everything that was put into place with Roe versus Wade, but they never
that was
did.
recent. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think kind of the big thing with that is, when we look at that topic of abortion, I'm sure most of us who are Christians, I think even most of us who may be just human beings, not that there's people who are not human beings out there in the world that look like human beings. But I mean, if you were to say, do you support killing children? More people would say absolutely not. I mean, I don't think that's the debate. So. I hope so too. I can remember being at Anderson and watching a video where a doctor was talking about the whole process of abortion, what all that entails, everything else. And one of the things he said is, and this was also a guy who was a Christian.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I thought was shocking, because again, he's basically building a case, basically saying we should make abortion illegal. Like,
sure. Yeah.
Okay. At the end, he says that he doesn't want it to become illegal. And of course, there's people in the class who like audible gasp.
Audible gasp.
And the reason why he said because the reason why I don't want it to be illegal is because I know what it is on the other side.
Mm-hmm.
Where if someone wants to abort their baby and there's no doctors and it's completely outlawed, illegal, if someone wants to abort their baby, they're going to do it. They're probably going to do it themselves by unsanitary means, and it could definitely put the mother at risk. And I think when you think about life in general, I would think that in those regards that, I would want the child to survive as much as I would want the mother to survive as well.
Sure thing.
And I think that's where sometimes when we get to certain political issues and how they intersect with faith, I think a lot of times we want to try to make it as clear cut and easy as possible, and not really look that there's a lot more layers and a lot more intricacies that happen. And you even mentioned it yourself, like, as a church, we want the government to do something about it, but what is the church going to do about it? And I think, even when with the whole Planned Parenthood thing and how certain states were defunding Planned Parenthood, I can remember one pastor goes, "Okay, church, what are you going to do? Are you going to offer pregnancy resources? Are you going to start giving out contraceptives? Are you going to start doing all these things that this corporation did?"
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of the bigger thing. Like, and again, you talk about tax dollars being invested in the community, because that's the whole thing. But, what are we doing with church funds? What are we doing with the funds that are given to church to kind of help in those regards? I know, like, within my community here in Stanton, we have like a Comfort Care Women, which is a pregnancy resource center that churches can give to kind of help. We have like a battered women's shelter that we help. But that's always the big thing, which I think this is kind of why when it comes to politics, it's never so cut and dry, because there's always a little hypocrisy in everything. It's like, when we think about if we think about, kind of the Republican side thing, the stereotypical view is they don't want abortions. So then so this woman has to have the child, but then they're not going to offer anything to kind of help this woman raise this child, give it clothes, give it shelter, give it food. Where then you look over on the other side, it's like, well, the Democrats, they're for abortion. So, but then they're also going to give you a lot of supplements and want to make decisions and policies, a lot of supplements to help you be able to put a roof over your child's head that you decide that you're going to eliminate anyway.
In theory.
In theory. Yeah. Again, this is all theory. This isn't. So when you think about that, it's like, well, whoa, that's kind of, There's
a lot of nuance
and
there.
We could spend all day talking about every single issue. Even when you think about the death penalty, should criminals who commit crimes, should they get the death penalty? Well, some people would say yes, but at the same time, how many people do we have on death row that were committed or were charged with crimes where they didn't have DNA evidence, and you find out later, like, oh, they were wrongly accused, or we were able to test some of this cold case, and we found out that, oh, this person that we have rotting away in jail for 40 years actually didn't do it.
It's pretty horrific, right?
So, stuff like that. So it's like, well, is it an issue of death penalty or not having death penalty, or is it an issue of trying to make sure we have more a reform within our criminal system, and then, again, and when you think about things, I even remember how the teacher who was alive when Ted Bundy was alive, and she remembered she was against the death penalty 100%. That's how she voted. And then she saw an interview with Ted Bundy, and he was just talking about how he found Jesus and went to church and, and everything else. And she just could tell by the way he was smirking, by his body language. She goes, even though I was against the death penalty, I definitely want that guy to die. Like, kind of like, oh, wow. Like, so, there's a lot of intricacies, and it's not every cut and dry, but I think as human beings, I'm just going to say human beings, I don't think it's an American problem. I think it's a human problem where we want to try to make things simple. If we can simplify everything, then it makes it a little bit more easier for me when I have to vote for somebody for the things that I think is going to best represent my beliefs and my values.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a really big topic I do want to, I'm not sure how long these are, Scott. I have no idea.
Well, we just keep going. We just keep going till, if it's 5 o'clock in the morning, this will be the longest podcast I've ever done. But we keep going until we have nothing more to talk about, Nick.
Great. I do want to piggyback off of like what you're getting at there. It reminds me of, the individualism of the American church, I think, is is another big threat facing the American church, where, individualism is an American value for sure. Where, you want to be self-sufficient, you think for yourself and that kind of thing. And, I think there are absolutely positives, to that sort of thing, but, there's hardly any individualism in in the Gospels, in the way Jesus talks about the actions of the church. He sends people out by twos, right? He sends disciples out by twos for one. There's what I think he presents is a vision of a very cohesive body of people who's living in community all the time. And I think you'd be kidding yourself if you'd think that cohesive body of that early church was not talking about politics. I'm sure they were talking all about politics back in their day, talking about the Jewish temple, talking about the Roman government. Once they spread the gospel beyond the Roman Empire, I'm sure they talked about what was going on in politics in other nations, other places. And so I think as a result, we have many American churches not wanting to talk about politics at all, which leaves individual Christians who go to these churches getting their politics elsewhere, getting their politics from tons of different media organizations, getting it, just from their friends, getting it from wherever. And they've never experienced a lively, healthy debate within the church about politics in a way that is not toxic and in a way that really looks at the politics of Scripture. And so I think there are many churches where that are politically inactive effectively. And then you have other churches where the leaders are like, no, I am going to talk about politics. And if you are a member of this church, this is. But in both cases, I think they're often divorced from. Basically, just to wrap that thought up, I think the too long didn't read version is I think the church, all kinds of churches, need to do a better job of taking the politics of Jesus seriously, and I think that would help to guide churches as communities in their politics, rather than just a bunch of individuals getting their politics from somewhere, and then when they all come to church, they all pretend that they don't have any politics. I think that doesn't do us any favors.
Yeah, I guess my follow-up question for you, Nick, is: do you think that in our culture today, where we have so much divisiveness over politics, do you think that, let's say, if me as a minister or somebody else as a minister, or even you when you're doing youth ministry, or even the pastor of the church that you attend, like if they just started going and started doing the politics of Jesus and really started opening it up, do you think that there'd be people who would be responsive to that and say, oh yeah, okay, yeah, this is great? Or do you think people would fight against it, go, hey, no, I have to hear this all day on Facebook and on the news. I definitely don't want to hear this garbage in the church.
Right. Yeah, I think you would get both. I think you would. I'm going to say something about the parable of the seeds and the sower. I think that was about the politics part. I think that wasn't about whether Jesus died for your sins or not. I think most people would be very pleased to be good soil to hear, look to Jesus and your sins will be forgiven. Which I do happen to believe, by the way. But I think the reason Jesus was so aware that there are going to be people who are strangled by the weeds, and there are going to be people who are like rocky soil that can't grow anything, I think it's because much of Jesus's ministry was so politics focused. And there were many people, even in Jesus's day, who were not going to be willing to hear Jesus's message, which was, radical caring for the poor and oppressed, whatever it took. And, rich people literally giving their money, sharing in all of their possessions and that kind of thing. That's why it was so hard for the rich young ruler to, come into the kingdom of heaven. It's not because he was sad because he wasn't sure if he wanted to ask Jesus to forgive his sins. I think he was very ready to do that. I think he couldn't feel like he could enter into Jesus's ministry, couldn't enter the kingdom of God, because he was scared of how it went against his political perspective.
Yeah, and even, that's one way of putting it. Like, I never thought about it that way, so that's interesting. That gives me something to chew on. But yeah,
chew it up, Scott.
But I think kind of interesting point about that is even when you look at the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the people who Jesus was always rallying, always in conflict with, because they weren't going to listen to what he was saying, which is about the kingdom, about the poor. And even the criticism of Jesus where he would say, you know, these were the things that you guys were supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
And you weren't doing it.
Yeah.
You know, you're supposed to be looking after the widows and orphans, but your hands were too busy. You know, your hands were too busy in the purse of the temple, and then your hands were also in the pockets of Roman officials who were kind of supporting you and supporting what you were doing. So when you look at that, you know, there's even kind of a religion in politics too, as much as, you know, we would like to say no, but I mean, there is. I mean, all you have to do is go to a board meeting, whether it's an elder board meeting or a budget meeting, and you already know that there's church politics already outside of American politics. So it's just kind of how things are. So when you say that, you know, the politics of Jesus, I would agree with you. Even when it came to, you know, obviously I think where most people would kind of really identify with was when it had to do with taxes. You know, whose face is on this coin? Well, then give to Caesar's who is Caesar's, give to God what is God. Jesus wasn't going to say, no, give to God, don't give to that dirty scoundrel Caesar, or he's not going to say, oh, just give to Caesar and, you know, give God whatever. He's saying no. Give your, you know, you give your, let's just use like you give your 10% to God. And then if you have to owe Caesar 20%, well, that's what out of your paycheck, you're out 30%.
Right.
I mean, it's not like, ooh, how can I keep more money in? It's like, no, if you have to give money to Caesar, you give it to the government. And then you also got to give it to God. And that's the way it is because Jesus Christ said so. So,
I think.
Go ahead.
Okay,
no,
you
go ahead.
Yeah, I will go ahead. I think this is a little bit of missiology. I said earlier, my background is I got a missions degree. Something that a characteristic of the early church that I think most people don't even notice is that I think the early church and Jesus's ministry before the church was very shrewd, very pragmatic in trying to get done what it wanted to get done. And I think that's kind of at odds with how a lot of Christians view Christianity and the church. I think a lot of Christians, even if they don't like this term, I think they still are very seeker sensitive, and which is the term that, you know, you have to seem like a very attractive individual, and your church has to seem like an attractive institution so that people will want to come. Anyone and everyone will want to come and be a part of your church and to get to know you so that then you can share the gospel with them. But I think that's not really what I read when I read the Gospels and when I read about the early church. I see a shrewd, practical church that knows that many people are not going to want to be a part of that. And that I mentioned the parable of the sower. I also mentioned the people going out 2 by 2. You know, Jesus tells them, shake the dust off your feet if they don't care to, you know, listen to what you have to say. Jesus knew right away that there were going to be many people who are not interested. You know, when Jesus says, you know, the church is the salt of the earth, you know, your whole meal isn't salt. You know, Jesus was basically saying he knows the church is going to be limited to just a little seasoning that's going to be sprinkled and spread throughout the earth. He knows that his church is probably not going to gain these huge numbers throughout the world. And, you know, despite the fact that Christianity is still probably, is it still the biggest religion percentage-wise for self-declared religion?
I
probably
believe
is.
So.
But, you know, I think people on all sides of the political spectrum probably think, oh, but they're not all real Christians, you know, in their own ways, probably conflicting on who's real and who's not, so to speak. But getting back to the idea of shrewdness, I think, you know, Jesus was just very aware that not everybody was going to like his message. And he told us the kinds of people who are not going to like his message. And that's the rich, the powerful, the rich and powerful people, the people who, you know, you can't fit a camel through the eye of a needle in the same way.
Yeah. And I think back to John's gospel where I think it's John 10 where Jesus is talking about, Unless I tell you the truth, if you do not eat of my flesh and drink of my blood, you will
Oh,
have no
that's a
part
great
of me.
example.
And there's people who, and it says that people started walking away from
Yes,
Jesus,
it
like
says
they
it.
started leaving. And then he turns to
Exactly.
his disciples, says,
Are you going to
he
leave
goes, "Are
me?
you going to leave too?" Like, I mean,
Yeah,
basically, I mean, man, that's a message where everyone's just getting up and leaving. And of course,
right.
Peter says, "Where else can we go? You're the one who has,
Yes.
you're the one who has eternal life."
And so, how did we get to this place where Christians feel like they have to be everything to everybody to try to do everything they can so that they can get as many people as possible, to pray the prayer of faith? I just think that these two messages, I think they could go together in theory, but I think in reality, if you're trying to do both of those things, if you're trying to radically care for the poor in a way that's going to make the powerful and the rich angry, then, like, by definition, you're not actually going to be reaching everybody, because there's going to be some people majorly turned off by your message, and Jesus knew that.
And I think kind of the big thing when it comes to the idea of attractional churches, I
Yeah,
think the big thing is that I think again, who are the people who were opposed to Jesus' message? Well, the
yeah,
rich and the powerful. Well,
right.
when you come to again, when you go to like kind of like, even when you think about like and maybe here's a good example, you think about Willow Creek.
Hmm.
I mean, the type of people who went to Willow Creek, where, I mean, Betsy DeVos went to Willow Creek. So you're already talking
Okay.
about people who are rich and powerful.
Yeah.
Even to the point where I think I used to get an email almost every month about their GL, like their
The summit.
summit
Yeah.
that they would always do. I
Right.
haven't gotten an email ever since the whole Bill Hybels scandal.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean,
They're going through something.
maybe a lot, and to be fair, maybe a lot of that's due because of them trying to restructure and them trying to be COVID.
Yeah.
But there's always is this thing that if you're the bigger you are, you have a whole different structure. And then again, you want to be attractional, because then if you can attract the rich and the powerful,
Right.
then you can have more money, which means you have more money to do more ministry or more programs to be
Yes.
able to help people, which then brings them into the fold. And
Yes.
I think kind of and sometimes even attractional churches take a lot of liberties with the word of God. And I'm not going to say that every sermon I've heard from a big church was a big pile of garbage, because I mean, there's some that are pretty good, but there are
Sure.
certain ones where you scratch your head and go, wow, that is totally not even close to actually what that verse means.
Sure
Or
thing. Yeah.
they build a whole series on what they believe and what they think, and then they just kind of
Yeah.
use a seasoning of scripture to kind of
Right.
prove their points.
A little
And it's
salt of
like,
the earth from the word of God.
exactly, yeah, no joke. So I mean, so when I guess so, when, again, going back, we're kind of getting off track here, but going back to the whole idea of civic religion, I think it's one of those things where you say, again, it is an intersection. It's just how much we as individuals can allow, how much of that is going to intersect, how much is that going to
Yeah.
bleed and spill over. Because even for myself, it's hard for me to keep my faith and my politics separate, because there are times where they are going to intersect.
Yeah.
Now,
Of course.
are there certain intersections where they're just like quick four-way stops, or are they some where basically there's just a spillover, it's a roundabout, and you can just keep spinning and spinning
Yeah.
and spinning around in that circle, because it's just a big thing that's going to cause a lot of congestion.
Yeah.
I guess that was a bad analogy, but it's the only one that I could come up at the top
I
of
love
my
those
head.
roundabouts. Yeah, I think this is me editorializing at this point, like kind of expressing my perspective. When it comes to how I intersect my church and my politics, my religion, my politics, is if when I think about any given policy or any given candidate, it's is this thing or person going to be good news for the poor, or is it going to be not so good news to the poor? And I think we can apply that beyond politics, but I think where we stand, and I'll be honest, I think where we stand, a lot of Christians stand today, is they're not using that test. They're using a different test. They're their test is more like, is this candidate or is this policy going to be, good news for America? That's, I think, and I really do think that's off base. Obviously, America is not the only country in the world. There happens to be at least 14 countries, I think, maybe even more than that. That was a joke, but we got to spend more time together, Scott, so you can know my sense of humor.
That's okay, Nick.
You're like, was he thinking continents? Because there's not 14 continents. All right, anyway, yeah, like the church. Ideally, the church is everywhere. Ideally, sprinkled salt. The whole every country is salted with Christians, and there's some countries where the civic laws are going to be favorable to the poor, and there's some countries where laws are not going to be favorable to the poor. And for a very quick and easy example that will not make anyone angry, like North Korea, great example of a country where what they do is bad news for the poor, right? Just not good. And I won't even venture to give a country I think that does great for the poor, because it'll just be too controversial. But no matter how good a Christian or a church thinks their country is at allying with them to bring good news to the poor, I think it is the job of the church to always have a little bit of skepticism that someday the powers that be might turn and not be such good news for the poor anymore. And the church always has to be ready and willing to take a stand and say, this is not good, even if you, listener, think that America is the best news that the poor has ever had and has the best chance of, spreading the gospel and reaching the poor, you have to always be honest with yourself, ready to see a day when perhaps your country that you love so much might stop working in the best interests of the poor and oppressed. And that's when you have to be prophetic, and that's when you have to stand up for the poor.
Yeah. And I think even for those who may be listening that are maybe in the ministry or they're leaders of churches, I think sometimes that's always a very difficult thing, because you want to preach, we need to love the poor, we need to love our neighbors, we need to, we need to love we need to love the widow, the orphan, the foreigner. We need to love them, love your neighbor as yourself. So then sometimes when that is a core belief in Christianity, and all of a sudden that, and then all of a sudden there is, maybe it may be your own governor that is making decisions that is going to, that's going to oppress them.
Yeah.
And then you are going to have to go and proclaim that and proclaim justice and proclaim all that stuff to your congregation. And you go, well, this is probably going to rub some people the wrong way because of where their political affiliations lie.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So I think that's kind of a big thing to really. So I think that's kind of always a hard thing. So again, I always say, like what Jim Lyons, our general director, says, you got to be bold. I go back to Micah 6:8, what is it that the Lord requires of you? Seek justice, love mercy, walk humbly with God. And if those are the three things that we are required to do from an Old Testament perspective, and I think that fits very nicely into loving God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and loving your neighbor ourselves. I think those things intersect nicely. I think in that regard, that is where we as leaders in the church, even we as Christians, that those are the things that we have to always be advocates for.
Yes.
Because
absolutely.
even anything else that we may believe politically, whether it's, freedom of religion, whether it's Second Amendment rights, whether it's abortion, whether it's big government, small government, how do we handle foreign affairs? All that other stuff is important. But I think the core thing is, as a Christian, what is it that I am required to do? And are the people that I want to elect to be my governor or to be my mayor or to be my president, are those the same type of values that I see them putting in that?
Right. Absolutely. And I think it's not overly cynical to do what I said, to always be sort of suspicious, always ready for the government to turn, is because ultimately, any given country, they're an institution, and institutions, even more than people, try to survive. Institutions try to keep themselves going, and so there will be times when the people who are in power are going to think like, I need to do this, and it might happen to be something that is not such good news for the poor. Whereas another thought that's been swirling in my head a lot lately is the idea of power. I think a lot of people wouldn't be able to define the word politics, and I'm sure there'd be a million definitions if you asked a million people. But I think it's not an oversimplification to say that politics is really just stuff having to do with power and how it's distributed.
Yeah.
And so when you're talking about politics, you're really just talking about power and how it's used. And so when you look at the church and when you look at Jesus and what did he have to say about power, is the same thing as saying, what did he have to say about politics? And at every turn, Jesus sides with the poor and he sides with the oppressed, and he's looking out for their interests.
Yeah, it definitely. And I think that's the big thing about power so much is when we look at contrast of what, when we look at the world, I think even in seminary, I had to read a book about New Testament culture, unlocking New Testament culture. And you looked at the things that were considered, pure and honorable and what was powerful then. And then you have Jesus, who basically talks about, well, you want to know what power is? Power is being a little kid. Power is being humble. Power is the last being first and the first being last. That's power. And I think, and it goes against the world so much. That mentality of, again, when you think of the Beatitudes, a lot of the blessed things are people who are who are low in the least powerful positions, and yet those are the ones who are elevated and called blessed. Not Caesar, not the head, not the high priest, not Jeff, the CEO of Bezos, Amazon. I was going to say I was going to say Bozo, but I know that wasn't correct. And I don't want to lose my Amazon Prime account because he hears me say this.
Wouldn't that be something?
But yeah, I mean, and I think that's always, and even like when power doesn't necessarily have to be like president, but even just like power being a board member on a ministry or even a teacher, even a Sunday school teacher, you can have those types of abuse of power. And I know I'm maybe having this conversation in a couple of weeks with someone who writes curriculum on sex in church and stuff.
Okay. Yeah.
Kind of within the Unitarian churches and even with the Church of Christ, and also grew up Catholic. And so when you think about all that and you think about power and stuff and how that's distributed, I mean, you could look at the Catholic Church and just the years of abuse. You could even look just recently with the SBC and that power, or even you can even look even more recent in Liberty University, like getting rid of Jerry Falwell Jr. And really because again, it's about values and it's about, well, this person's not representing the values of this institution, but really it's like, well, the reason why, but then you also think about, well, how did he get into that position? Well, because his dad started it. His dad was a big name in evangelical, and then you inherit power. And I mean, it's just like Caesar, Caesar, once Caesar dies, who's the next in line? It's a very hierarchy. It's about power. And Jesus basically says power, that's not true kingdom power. Kingdom power is something totally
upside down
else. It's upside down, the upside down kingdom, as seminary people would say.
Right, definitely.
All right, Nick, is there any other thoughts or any musings that you have before we start wrapping up this podcast?
Well, we froze, so apparently that's all we can talk about.
No, did we? Because you're still moving.
I can't hear you right now.
Ooh.
So maybe that's just going to have to be it.
Okay. Well, Nick, again, thank you so much.
Can you hear me now, Scott?
I definitely can. You froze a little bit, but you're still good on here.
Okay.
But yeah,
okay.
That's okay. But, why don't we go ahead and wrap this up, because who knows what the night will bring.
That's good.
But Nik, thank you
Yes.
so much for joining me. It's been a very interesting, very educational conversation. And I do believe for those of you who are listening, hopefully you're able to take something away from this conversation with Nik and I, and hopefully we would like to hear what you think. And again, you can comment either on any of the Podomatic pages. You can comment on my website, thescottstedman.com. You can also send me an email or a message on my Facebook page, the official Scott Stedman podcast page. And again, we love to hear from you, want to know your thoughts, your views, and definitely be dialoguing with you. And again, Nik, thank you again. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope you have a great evening.
You too. Thanks for the opportunity.
All right, everybody. You guys have a great night too, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.